Hi everyone. I'm just going to take a few minutes and wait for people to start showing up if they're going to. This is the first day of four power plants you may have taken for granted. And today's session is going to be on coffee. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and see if anyone's here. The main thing I wanted to tell you is that if for some reason I don't see your questions, if you have a question, hi, hi Jessica, hi Kirsten. If I don't see you or your question, I will answer your question afterwards in the comments section. And I'll also be posting a link to basically a spiritual practice that you'll get as an email. Hi. That you'll get as an email after each one of these sessions, along with the replay. Also, the other little bit of housekeeping I have today is that there's some remodeling going on in my building, and I'm hoping that it won't intrude on this recording. But if for some reason it does and you can't hear part of it, I will add I will record over that section and send that out in the email as well. So, it's nice to see everybody. How are you all doing? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just going to take a brief moment to ground. Just feel your feet connecting with the earth. Feel the energy from your feet going down, about a foot below the floor or the ground, where there is an energy center that connects you with all of nature, including the coffee plant and all the grace of nature. And then feel that energy go down, all the way to the heart of Earth and connect with the Earth's dreaming for you. And that energy now comes up. It goes through your heart, up to the sun, to heart of heaven, and back down through the crown chakra of your head and into your heart. So, I'm ready to begin, and hopefully this will begin to transform how we look at these powerful helpers that have been misunderstood by our culture. So, I want to welcome everybody and say hello. And basically, I have had sort of a difficult relationship with coffee. I started out in college abusing coffee. I had a paper that I needed to finish in order to graduate, and I got really into espresso and Cuban coffee at this time. And so what I did was I borrowed my roommate's coffee maker, and I made 6 cups of Cuban coffee a day for 3 days so that I would stay up for 20 hours a day. And what happened was that after about 3 days of this, I realized that this was probably not a good idea, and I had kind of overdone it a little bit. And so this was sort of the beginning of like an up and down relationship I had with coffee for a couple of years, where I got really into espresso and cappuccino and, Cuban coffee and, like the strongest forms of coffee that I could get. And I would feel sort of like I didn't feel right unless I had my coffee. And eventually, this started to give me some trouble with my digestion. So I eventually just completely got off of coffee altogether. And I felt very pleased with myself that I had released and gotten rid of this toxic substance in my life, and, it wasn't going to be part of my life anymore. So several years later, I was blessed to meet Dr. J.E. Williams, who is an acupuncturist and an herbalist and also a medicine person. and he gave a superfood class at about these wonderful substances like maca and yacon and goji berries, all these things that come from the rainforest, and how wonderful and healthy these things are for you. And then he mentioned that coffee was a superfood. And I almost started laughing, because to me, coffee was a bad thing. Coffee was a toxin that I had gotten out of my life. And so he began to talk about how coffee had been misused in our culture, and that there was a healthier way to approach coffee. And I'm going to talk about his way of working with coffee a little bit later. But this was my introduction to realizing that maybe the problem with coffee wasn't coffee, but had been me, and my lack of knowledge about how to work with it in a good way. So at the same time, I also became interested in a healer named Cindy Dale. And she had worked with an ayahuasquero in the Amazon. So she was very familiar with power plants. And she also began to talk about coffee, tea, and other substances like that as if they were power plants to be used with respect. So I began to think about this and realized that I had completely misunderstood coffee. So I began to investigate a little bit about coffee and how it had been misused and how we might use it in a better way. So first, a little bit about how coffee was misused. I get some of this from Andrew Weil's excellent book, From Chocolate to Morphine, in case any of you have read it, where he talks about like safe use of these substances. And basically, he talks about all of these plants that we're going to be talking about: coffee, tea, tobacco, and cacao are all in a class of drugs known as stimulants. And what they do is they borrow tomorrow's energy today. So that's how you can become dependent on them if you don't use them wisely, because you're actually borrowing from your future energy. And you have to pay your body back in some way. So I began to really look at ways that I could do this. One way, obviously, is the coffee was masking a health problem that I had. I had a hormonal issue. So treating that was one step of doing it. I also became interested in adaptogens like ginseng and rhodiola, and doing that was another way of increasing my energy so that I didn't have to depend on coffee to do a job that it wasn't meant to do. But it looks like that coffee, when it was introduced to Europe, almost began making addicts right off the bat. Andrew Weil talks about several composers who became addicts, including Bach, who actually wrote a choral piece called the Coffee Cantata, where one of the characters raves about how wonderful coffee is. Give me coffee, 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 coffee. And it completely reminded me of, how I felt about coffee when I was drinking it heavily. So it shows that right off the bat, we really didn't understand how to work with this. So I began to investigate how coffee works in its sort of home parent cultures. How is it used wisely? And how can we learn from that and adapt it to our own coffee drinking so that we can use it in a good way? So the earliest use of coffee is from a tribe in Ethiopia where it grows wild. They're called the Galla people, Galla, and they used the whole plant, the berry, which is called the coffee cherry. And in many cases, a lot of these substances are used as a food first. So what they would do is they would take the coffee fruit, the cherry, which is sweet, cover it with like an animal fat, and then they would use it as kind of like a trail mix so that it would have the combination of fats, the sugar from the fruit, and the energy from the caffeine. And this would give them an extra push when they needed to travel, and I think they might have even used it like on military campaigns. So it was almost like a really, like an extreme power bar kind of thing. So that was its first use. Then it became adopted by Yemeni Sufis who made it into a drink. And when this happens, this is the first time you see coffee being used the way shamans would use ayahuasca. Because what happens is, some researchers believe that because the Sufis in Yemen might have been influenced by Sufis in India who already had a tradition of using sacred plants for spiritual purposes, that what they realized about coffee was that it was not only a medicine, but that it was also, it could propel you into a sacred, blissful state where you would have an extreme, almost single-minded focus. So basically what they were doing with the coffee is they were drinking several cups of small cups of coffee throughout one night, and they were chanting the names of Allah, which is a spiritual practice in that tradition. And between the chanting and the single-minded focus of the coffee, they were able to reach a very blissful state where they felt like they were more in contact with the spiritual energies that was the goal of their religion. So you can see that the coffee has been given a job to do, where it is a vehicle for spiritual contact. Another example of this is the whirling dervishes, who were using the coffee not only to have the energy to do their dancing, but also at the same time to reach this blissful state. So it's interesting that within this tradition, there is a brief moment where coffee is being used in a sacred way. And for basically the first 300 years of coffee in the Middle East, it was associated with these traditions. It was considered, it would be like the way we associate ayahuasca with the Amazon, or peyote with the Huichol people. It was a spiritual medicine. So I'm going to take a moment and see if I can see any of your questions right now and answer them if I can. So just let me take a minute to, it's always, I may not be able to. So if I can, I'm just going to go back and let me see if I can. Can't stay for the live, but I look forward to the replay. Fantastic. Great to see you. Okay, so that's what I can see right now. I will get back to questions later. So the next area that we see coffee having, and the other thing that's really important to know about the Yemeni Sufi tradition is that this was done one night a week. So one night a week you would have this all-nighter spiritual ceremony. And then the rest of the week, the body would have a chance to recover the energy that they had borrowed by taking the coffee. So this is one sort of safe way to work with coffee. The other tradition comes from Ethiopia itself. And this is a really beautiful ritual that is done basically to kind of socialize, to harmonize a family, to kind of cement a friendship. And it's interesting that the coffee is actually considered to be something that can transform the spirit in this tradition. So if you're curious about the actual preparation, I posted a video of this from a cooking show in the event Facebook page that's connected to the group. So you can see it there if you want. But basically, 3 rounds of hand-roasted coffee that is hand-ground and mixed with spices like cardamom is served in very small cups, and it's served to each one of the participants while the coffee is being roasted. Frankincense is being burned. So there's a connection with the spirit that way. And after each one of these rounds of coffee, it's considered a different kind of clearing, so that by the time you get to the 3rd round, the spirit has been transformed. And because this is like a small dose of coffee, it can be done either once a day or even in the morning and in the evening. So you can see here that there are kind of two different types of approaches. One approach where you have a lot of coffee, but you only do it once a week. And another approach where you have a small amount that's done on a daily basis. So let me see if there's any more questions here, if I can. Okay, so about what century was the Yemeni Sufi coffee ceremony taking place? I think this is in, I can't remember now. I will look that up and post that later. But I think it's like maybe around 1100 or something like that. It's relatively early because I think that it was pretty soon after. It was like around 300 years, and I think part of it might have been around 1100. So it was either like 1100 to 1400 or 800 to 1100. But let me look that up and come back with you with the answer to that. That's a great question. And it's funny because in my research, I couldn't find examples of them doing it now. It's almost as if this was a period of time, and what has continued in the Middle East is a tradition of both coffee drinking and coffee ground reading. And what's interesting about the coffee ground reading is that that aspect of coffee as a spiritual practice actually made it to Europe. And coffee ground reading became hugely powerful and popular. And it actually forms the symbolic vocabulary for symbols like the Lenormand cards for people who are card readers. You might recognize symbols like the cross or the anchor. Some of that comes from that early European coffee house, coffee ground reading, and later tea reading. So it's kind of funny how that, and the coffee ground reading is still popular in the Middle East. I work for a Middle Eastern psychic hotline, and one of the services they offer is coffee ground reading. So, so let's see here if we have any more questions, and then I will keep going here. So the next thing is that basically, what is it that makes coffee basically, what happened to coffee that made it sort of come out of balance like this? And one of the things that you find is that, at least in the United States, coffee is associated with productivity. So there's nothing mindful about it. And we're taught to drink large amounts of it. Like you go to Starbucks and you get like a venti, right? And you just gulp it down as fast as possible, and you use that single-minded focus that coffee gives you to get more work done. And while there's nothing wrong with that, occasionally it's doing it repeatedly that can set up the misuse and sort of the bad patterns of it. And at the same time, what happened in Europe was there a tradition of, because of the coffee craze, there was a lot of exploitation of coffee growers and coffee growing places that created a lot of pain and suffering for local indigenous peoples. And so a lot of the fair trade movement has been around coffee production because there's been a lot of work needed to do to make that, the coffee growing and coffee production, benefit the people who are actually doing the work. So you can see how there was kind of like almost a built-in addictive pattern that came into both the use of coffee and the production of it. And so what is a better way to relate to coffee? Well, this is the part where I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a physical practice. And this is what I learned from J.E. Williams, who taught that class about superfood. And he also has written the book The Andean Codex, for those of you who may have read that. He's an herbalist. So basically, his advice is that you should try to drink organic coffee. That right off the bat, that helps you to get more nutrients than the more sort of toxic forms of coffee. He also recommends that you use a French press if you can, that will get the maximum nutrients out of the coffee. And then he says that our habits of adding dairy and sugar to the coffee is part of what strips the nutrients away from what could be a superfood for us. So what I like to do is to add like a nut milk and another kind of sweetener. I happen to use stevia. And so you can get the maximum health benefits from the coffee. So that's one way of working with it. A second way of working with the coffee is to give it a job to do. So I experimented a little bit with this, and I actually found that drinking a certain amount of coffee, like normally I have like maybe a cup or so, a little bit more than that. You don't want to drink more than 4 cups a day because that's a safe dosage. But if you drink like maybe 2 or a little bit more, or if you drink very small cups, what will happen is that you will begin to, if you do chanting, I chanted my power song, and I did actually begin to experience greater connection with my guardian animal spirit than I would have normally. Now, obviously, this is not a traditional practice. You can chant a mantra. You can use like any kind, if there's a song you sing, like a medicine song or just a spiritual song. But there's something about coffee that lends itself to single-minded focus that involves some kind of activity. Like it's not quite as contemplative as other substances. So doing something like, chanting, dancing, something like that just seems to lend itself to the coffee. That it has a little bit more of a, and I also tried another thing which some people do with plant medicines in general, which is to meditate on the flower or plant itself. And obviously, since I don't grow in an area where people grow, I don't live in an area where people grow coffee, I just meditated on the flower of the plant itself, which is quite beautiful. And that was a really interesting experience as well. So I would say the last thing I would want to get into before we take another break for questions is one way to give the coffee a job to do, which is the spiritual practice that I'll be sending out tonight to people who have signed up, is, and this comes from Cindy Dale, she was talking about power plants in general as being inherently associated with shamanic work, because the shaman is looking for powerful allies to aid him or her in their medicine work. So what she recommends is that in the morning, before you ever drink your coffee, with your intent, stir into your coffee each of the elements that you work with. Some people use 4 elements, some people use 5, some people use many more. But the reason why I think this is a wonderful practice is because it's simple, it's very subtle. You could do this even at work. No one will know you're doing it. And when you drink the coffee, you begin to actually ingest and embody into your physical body the elements that you work with every day in your shamanic work. And not only does this help heal and balance your body, but it changes your relationship to coffee. This may seem like a subtle practice that is almost like too subtle to make a difference. But honestly, I have discovered that by doing this, on the days that I do this, My coffee drinking is different. My energy with the coffee is different than on the days that I don't. It's almost as if the coffee needs to have another job to do besides enhance our productivity. And by working with the elements, because working with the elements is one of the sort of relatively safe ways to interact with shamanic energies, working with the elements seems to be accessible to almost everyone. You really can't go wrong with it. I mean, so far I have not shared this practice with anyone who reported an unpleasant side effect. So this is the shamanic practice that I will be sharing with everyone. It's more of a self-healing practice, but it will help to begin to transform your relationship with coffee. So let's see here. So Kirsten says, I've started stirring in the elements into my coffee, and it really does make a mindful connection with the plant spirit. Thanks for letting me know. Oh, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting how, you know, it's almost as if what we're really trying to do with these practices, whether you do it by the physical practice of not adding cream and sugar and doing the French press and having small amounts because that's what you do with superfoods, or whether you do this more spiritual, more shamanic practice, what we're trying to do is break the cycle of associating coffee with extreme productivity, where we push our bodies past what they can do and borrow energy from the future. And it also really helps to respect the spirit of the plant. The plant wants to work with us in a good way. All of these plants want to work with us in a good way. But I believe they just want to be, approached with respect. So let's see. Abi Kabas, I'm watching live from the Philippines. Hi. This is wonderful. Yeah, and if you are lucky enough to live in an area where people grow coffee, spend some time with the plant. One of the traditional ways of working with a plant spirit is to either grow it, which some people do. Some people grow coffee in their gardens, or to spend time. There's a practice you can do where you could take a coffee bean that hasn't been ground up and put it in a medicine pouch and put it underneath your pillow. And you can do this with any of the plants. And pray for a dream or pray for a journey if you lie down to journey, to understand more about your relationship with the coffee spirit and what can you do to improve that relationship and how can you work together. Because really what we're trying to do is to work with this gift, this really powerful medicine, in as positive a way as possible. And obviously also the coffee will probably guide you to not only to use it in a more healthy way, but to buy coffee from places where people are trying to give back to the environment and to the people who grow the coffee so that they are sustained in a good way also. So let me see if there's any more questions. Hi. Hi, Abby. How you doing? So just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. So basically, I just want to ask, does anybody have any questions that anything I didn't cover? Do the practices make sense? Just sort of let me know if any of these practices sort of make sense to you. You can just give me a heart or the thumbs up sign. I'll give everybody a few minutes. Oh, good. Okay, great. Okay. And afterwards, I'm going to post a link for all of you to sign up if you haven't had a chance. Not only will you get this practice, but the real thing that I want to make sure is that all of you have a chance to watch Kirsten's presentation on Wednesday and to get the email with her practices. Oh, wonderful. I'm seeing the likes and the great. The reason why I want to make sure that you see Kirsten's presentation, if you can't see it live, to see it as a replay, and that you get her practices, is that Kirsten's going to explain not only how to use tobacco in a healthier way, but also how to use tobacco in a beginning way as a shamanic practitioner, how to pray with it, how to use it for purification, and the beginning steps to using it for healing. Because in the world of sacred tobacco, for those of you who want to do more healing work, and a lot of you have said you do, the tobacco spirit is one of the most powerful herbs that there is. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. I'm going to check one more time to see if there's questions. All good, perfect, fantastic. Thank you for being here, Jorge. And I will see you in the comments, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.